If they see that you've made some sacrifices, that you have put money aside, and you do make a genuine effort to pay back as much as you possibly can in advance of sentencing, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, that is going to impact the amount of time that you get.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona for another thrilling episode of Set for Sentencing. I'm so excited about today's guests for so many reasons, but maybe because she is really on that short list of former prosecutors that I think are now just kick-ass, amazing, compassionate, empathetic defense lawyers. People don't understand defense, prosecution, very different thing. And a lot of prosecutors, they just don't cut the mustard when they come over to this side of the aisle. But Ashley Adams does. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, how are you? Great to see you.
It's great to see you again. So this is the cool thing. Another cool thing, another reason I'm so excited is because I've had Ashley Adams on the podcast once before, but it feels like eons ago. You were episode 7, and it was
COVID, I think.
Was that? Oh my gosh! It was
Yes.
probably was, or right on the heels of it. So, episode 7, stories from the front lines of justice, from prosecution to defense. That was the name of the episode. And so, for all you new listeners out there, I'm going to put a link in the show notes because you really should go back and listen to it because it's a very, very cool story about the journey from one side to the other and what the distinctions were, and what you learned and what you went back and thought about what your days as a prosecutor you might have done differently now that you've seen the other side of it. And I just love that
I
episode.
was really mean.
Well, I don't remember having to deal with you that much when I was at the federal defender. So, but I remember way back in the day when I was a baby federal defender and our friend Darrow Saul was still on this earth, and I think I had something going on with you, and I asked him, do you know this woman? And he had very nice things to say about you.
Well, I worked with him at O'Connor Kavanaugh for many years. He
Huh?
used to sleep in the office. I'm not kidding. He had a cot in some weird closet office, and he would sleep there and bring like a fresh tie. And he was insane. He was such a hard worker. I miss him.
Yeah, I hadn't heard the sleeping in the office story, but I have zero trouble believing it because he burned the candle at both ends until it could burn no more. I want to do a whole podcast on that, just to honor Darrow. It was just so many stories we could tell. But we are actually here to talk about something different today. And one of the things, so Ashley is a white collar defense lawyer primarily. That's her specialty. That's what she did at the U.S. Attorney for so many years. And we are talking about a very important component of sentencing that's also, unfortunately, very overlooked component of sentencing, and that is restitution. And so that is what we're going to drill down on today. Ashley gives presentations about this, and she's very, very good at a very holistic approach from restitution. That is to say, something we, just like mitigation, we get in early and start thinking about this and think about it during plea negotiations and think about the long-term consequences, because restitution is like, I don't know, herpes. It just stays with you forever. Like it never goes away until you pay it. But, a lot of our clients have very, very significant restitution orders, and it could take a lifetime or more to pay. So there's a lot we need to know and a lot we're not doing, and that is what we want to talk about. So I guess we could just start with the basics. What we're in federal, the land of federal courts, so states have their own deal, but what's the general landscape of federal restitution?
Well, so first of all, it's mandatory. The full amount that is owed is mandatory, regardless of the financial condition of the defendant. In some state courts, the judges will consider the financial condition of the defendant. That is not relevant in federal court. The second thing that's important is that, the government can collect that restitution for up to 20 years. And it's not 20 years from the day you were sentenced. It's either 20 days from the days you were sentenced or the day you were released from prison. So if you do actually do time, including a halfway house, the time doesn't start to run until you get out. The third thing that I think is really important is that, this is no surprise, the government has an immense amount of power, and there's no exception when it comes to collection. I think a lot of people, don't know much about the reach of the federal government and what they can do. And they think, for example, that, state exemptions like the homestead exemption apply, and those kinds of exemptions don't apply under federal law. So there's just a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about restitution,
Yeah.
which is why I started talking about it.
Well, yeah, I didn't. Okay, so I've been practicing federal law for a long time, and I just learned something new. I didn't know about the 20-year rule, which I guess is sort of encouraging because if you can outlive your restitution order, you can go about your life after 20 years. But I didn't know that
Well,
20 years is the
yeah.
max.
But let's say, for example, though, that the government has already filed a lien on your house.
Yeah.
That lien is still good after the 20 years. They just can't institute new collection after
Right.
that 20-year period, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, it does make sense. And and I did know that, mandatory and that it's your financial situation is not relevant. People get that confused because your financial situation is relevant when it comes to fines and sometimes fees like special assessment, but the judge can take into consideration your ability to pay a fine. But when it comes to restitution, that is, and for people who may not know the difference, restitution is what's the difference between a fine and a restitution, just to get really basic level.
Right. Well, so essentially restitution is to compensate the victim, and fine is more of a punishment.
Yeah.
It's more, and
Yeah.
forfeiture is punishment too. So just because you may have forfeited a piece of property as part of your sentence doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get credit for that on the restitution side. You said something that I think is really important, because even though the payment of restitution doesn't take into consideration the defendant's financial condition, how that restitution is paid can take into consideration that defendant's condition. So that's why it's important that we negotiate on the front end during the plea process, how that restitution gets paid out. And so I've written a few articles about this, and you want to make sure in the plea agreement that you come up with a payment schedule, something that your client can manage, which of course could be amended down the road, but your client's not going to be able to pay anything or much of anything while they're in prison. But maybe when they get out, you want to negotiate like a $500 a month payment. I mean, those are things that you can control on the front end.
Well, that's great news too. Usually, I should have thought about that, but I didn't even consider that you could negotiate a payment schedule as part of a resolution and a plea. Usually, I get to sentencing and the pre-sentence report's done and they've gone over the financial situation, and the judge says you've got to pay X dollars a month, in restitution. But you're saying that some prosecutors will make agreements about that with you in the plea stages.
Well, I've really had to push them to do this. And just for reference, so 18 USC section 3664 F2 A and B talks about how the court determines the manner and schedule of payments. And so in that, process, the court looks at, what resources that does the defendant have? Are they jointly controlled by anybody else, or does the defendant have sole control? What is this person's projected earnings? Are they educated? Are they not educated? And then what other, financial obligations do they have? So those are things that you can negotiate and look at up front. Ultimately, the court has the final say, but those are things that I have negotiated lots of payment schedules, especially in white collar cases when the clients have resources.
Okay. And then tell me about the possibility that after that payment schedule is negotiated or imposed by the court, that it could be modified, and who would have a say in that modification?
Well, that's a really good question.
Thanks. I read it off your outline.
Yes. Well, so the statute says that the only party that can modify the payment schedule or attempt to is the government. And that generally happens because either the defendant comes into financial resources, or they're making more money when they're on the outside. Typically, every couple of years, the financial litigation unit, and those are the people that are the ones that manage the restitution payments, they will have defendants fill out these really onerous affidavits. And in those affidavits, you have to put down, what you're making, what your assets are, et cetera. And so if they see, for example, that you're making, $50,000 more this year in your salary, then they are going to go back to the court and ask that you pay more money. There is another statute, though, that says the government has to be reasonable. And, if a defendant is really struggling to make their payments, they can go into court and ask the judge for some relief in that regard. And we've done that. We've represented a lot of people who, they just can't keep up with their payments, or inflation, or, lots of life circumstances may impact their ability to pay.
Yeah. Especially after being tagged with a felony conviction, and it makes it so hard to get a job and earn an income and everything else. Okay, well, that's good to know. Well, you mentioned the financial litigation unit, so we have to talk about that. But before we do, I think let's stay in the realm of plea and sentencing. So we know that, things can be negotiated in a plea agreement. We know that restitution is designed, exists to make victims whole. These are direct financial losses. It could be money that was taken by fraud. It could be hospital bills in an aggravated assault case. It could, there's any number of ways that we can harm people financially, and that's what restitution is for. So that does kind of explain why it's mandatory, because victims need to be made whole. But there's another aspect to this, which is, restitution is hard to pay back. But one of the things that I like to help clients understand early on in the case is to the extent they can make any restitution now, or at least put it aside, and so that you can walk into sentencing saying, this is important to me. This is the way that we tell our redemption stories. This is the way we show the court that we have genuine remorse. And this is the way we show that we have every intention of making the victim whole and righting the wrong that we've committed. So what's your general take on that aspect of it when you're counseling a client? Especially that client who says, well, I just given all of my money to the lawyer, and I lost my job, and my kid's in college, and I don't really have any money right now.
Well, obviously, and this goes without saying, the more you can pay back in advance certainly impacts, I think, the recommendation that's going to be made by the prosecutor. If they see that you've made some sacrifices, that you have put money aside, that you haven't spent it all on private jets or whatever you decided to spend your money on, and you do make a genuine effort to pay back as much as you possibly can in advance of sentencing, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, that is going to impact the amount of time that you get. I have a case right now where it's one of those access behavioral health fraud cases. And, the losses are in excess of $4 million. And, my client went out and sold her house, and she has put that money in an account, and she's going to pay that money towards her restitution. And I think that's going to really be impactful when it comes time for her to be sentenced. I really do.
Yeah, and for those clients who, we have these white collar clients who are used to these multiple six-figure a year jobs, and they don't have their job and everything else, and they say, "Well, I'm not working." Well, guess what? There's probably a job out there for you. It may
Yes.
not be so glamorous. It may be working at Burger King. It may be sweeping up, but you know, my advice is get any job, because if you're
Any job.
making minimum wage and you set aside $500 for restitution, that's a huge, show of good faith to say that this means something to you. And you're not sitting around, especially our case. Sometimes our cases take a year to resolve. So you're
Yeah.
just sitting around feeling sorry for yourself on pretrial release because your life's in limbo and you're waiting to see what your fate, your destiny is. Or are you going to go out and be proactive? And I know it's easier said than done, but I just think that's very, very important. And it
Oh,
shows your character.
I do. I think, well, especially if they're on probation, they have to be working anyway. But I do think it's good for us to be able to go into court and say, look, judge, this client has been working, 70 hours a week or whatever it is to make ends meet and to try to pay off some of this restitution. So
Yeah.
certainly that's important.
And here's a dumb logistical question. I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, but so say I put aside 50 grand for my sentencing to show the judge that I'm willing to pay the restitution. Like, how do I give that money? I know it's like not easy for them to take your money.
No, how many times I've had this come up? So it used to be we could pay that money into the clerk of the court ahead of time. Okay,
Yeah.
so that the judge can see, okay, I've paid 50,000. The clerks do not like for us to do that. It's a pain for them. It's hard for them. I don't know why. Maybe because it's the government and they can't figure it out. But now they will only accept payments after the defendant has been sentenced. What I do is I'll take that money from my client, hold it in my trust account, and then, tell the judge I'm holding this $50,000 in my trust account, which we are going to go down and deposit immediately with the clerk after the sentencing is done.
Good.
That
I
way
like
your
that.
client isn't tempted to go out and, throw a big party or something.
Right. One last night at the
That's hurrah.
gentleman's club. Um, well, okay. So that's really practical advice. Thank you. So okay, well, so back to the financial litigation unit. First of all,
My
the acronym, is it an acronym?
Yeah, it's the financial, I call them the blue flu.
Yeah,
Uh,
they call themselves the flu, the
yeah,
financial litigation unit. And I'm like, what did they just sit around and be like, what can we do to think of the ugliest,
oh,
to show them that we're gonna like make your life miserable because we are your sickness. Like they could have said like the financial litigation team, and then they'd be flight, and we're soaring to new heights to make everyone whole. Like, give me some hope, give me some positivity. No, you've got the flu. Did you ever see that movie Better Off Dead? With
no,
with that little fucking paperboy kid, and Lloyd Dobler owed him $2, and he was stalking him, and this little evil little kid would be like, "I want my $2," and he'd follow him all around, like to the ends of the
no.
earth. That sounds like the flu. They're gonna
And they're
follow you to the
miserable
ends of the
people.
earth.
Yeah, they're miserable and they don't care. And I'll tell you just a little tidbit of interesting trivia. So, it used to be back in the old days, especially when I was a prosecutor, nobody really paid attention to restitution because it didn't matter because nobody did anything about it. Well, during the Trump administration, the first one in 2016, Congress looked into why the government wasn't collecting restitution. And obviously the answer was they didn't have enough bodies to do it. And so Congress allocated a bunch of FTEs, which is a fancy word for hiring more people, so that these flu units around the country could be beefed up. So flu started getting really aggressive in terms of collection in 2018-19. And so that's another reason why restitution has become far more important, because they're far more aggressive than they used to be back in the day.
They're coming for you.
They're coming
And
for you.
your outline says every district in the country has their own flu unit now. Is that right?
Yes, every district. And,
Wow.
these aren't friendly, kind people. I mean, they're a collection agency. They're like any other collection agency. They don't really want to hear the sob story. They have an immense amount of power. They can subpoena, they can take your deposition, they can do debtors exams, they can get bank records. Not to mention the fact that they, have these financial affidavits they make you sign under penalty of perjury. So if you lie, it's a separate charge altogether. So
Wow.
it's just, yeah, fun people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they're out there, they're organized, they're coming for you. So this is so there's basically, I guess let's talk about the life of the collection of the debt. So we talked about hopefully paying some back before sentencing or right on the heels of sentencing. Now there's most of our if you have restitution in the millions of dollars, I think it's very likely that you're going to prison next, because most do in these kinds of cases. And
Sure.
so let's assume the worst case scenario. You don't get probation straight away. You end up in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. What and your restitution follows you there, does it not? And what does that look like?
Yeah, so it follows you everywhere for the rest of your life. The
Like
government
me.
actually has a lien per the federal lien statute on everything that you own. But nonetheless, it starts when you go to prison. And there is I looked at it this morning, and it's very complicated, but in essence, the Bureau of Prisons, they have a program statement that they put together back in 2005. And I think it was meant to be helpful. It's just very unclear. But in essence, all inmates are required to participate in what's called the Inmate Financial Responsibility Program. And in that program, they not only counsel inmates on how to be more financially responsible, but they also give them some help and instruction on how to pay off their fines and restitution. Participation is not mandatory, but if you don't participate, then you lose a lot of privileges. You might not have the best housing, you might not get certain work assignments. So they really do hold this over your head, but they start collecting money from inmates right away. I mean, they will take a percentage of whatever is in your inmate account, right? So, and there's
Hmm.
no set percentage. There's all these factors that go into, which is the part I don't like, because I feel like it should be the same percentage across the board, but it's really up to the inmate's counselor. So that's how that works. But
That's so
they certainly take
interesting.
money out while you're in prison.
And so that's money you make working, because they do pay you a pennies on the dollar for working while you're incarcerated, right?
Right.
So they take some of that, which isn't much to begin with. What is
Right.
that,
It's like
dollar a day?
$25 a week or something.
And then you can get other people, friends, family, spouses can put money on your books, which you need in to survive in prison, for commissary, to get food and hygiene items, and everything costs money in there if they have phone time, although I hear they're making some of that less expensive or free, but it's all a racket. They're trying to get inmates to pay for anything and everything they can,
Yeah.
and nothing's cheap. So you're saying if my, nice uncle supports me by putting money in my books every month, they can get at that too.
They can. I mean, in the policy, it says that the inmate should have a reasonable amount of money in their account to make phone calls and to buy things from commissary. But again, it's not like a set formula. So it seems a little unfair to me. I mean, suppose that, somebody's mad at you and they're like, well, I think we should take more money out of his account because he's doing X, Y, and Z. But yeah,
Yeah.
they can take money out of the account that's been put in there by your family. True.
I wonder if there's anything you could get in the way of a sentencing order, for the judge, because the orders I've seen are saying, yes, you have to pay restitution starting when you get out of prison at X dollars a month, but they never say anything about what happens when you're in prison.
Some of them do. I think it's more common now for the orders to say they have to pay something while they're in prison. I mean, certainly I've seen those types of orders here. I know Judge Logan's standard order talks about paying restitution while you're in prison.
Oh, and do they talk about percentages, or they just say you have to do it?
It just says you'll participate in the program and it doesn't say a percentage.
Mm, okay.
Once you're out though, the government can take up to 25% of your paycheck. And that's not like after you've paid your bills, it's after you paid your taxes. So
Okay.
that's crazy. That's a lot of money. I mean, they even
Yeah.
take people's social security that are
Wow.
on only social security, they'll take up to 25%. And just another point, that's meant to be the high point, the ceiling, not the floor where you start negotiating. So I always try to stay around 15% because really 25% is high. That's a lot. That's a quarter of what you're making.
Yeah. Yeah, again, we don't think about it. We overlook this, but that extra 10% could make a world of difference for a
Yes.
client who's struggling financially. And so now, okay, so we've done our time in BOP, and the other lovely aspect of the federal system is that everybody then has a period of what we call supervised release. So that's akin to probation, where you have a probation officer, and they are monitoring your every move, and they're monitoring your finances. So, and the reason why I bring this up is because there's a really potent distinction about what happens if you're willfully shirking your restitution responsibilities when you're on supervision versus when you're off supervision. So tell me just what's the landscape now that I've got a probation officer who's looking over my shoulder? How does that play into the restitution issue?
Well, it's mandatory either way, and you can be penalized either way, but it's obviously you're under the watchful eye of your probation officer, so it's a lot more likely to get noticed if you're not paying than when you're off probation. And they can essentially put you back in jail because you're violating a condition of your supervised release, which requires you to make whatever restitution payments they've ordered you to make.
Hmm.
Uh, but and it used to be that people really stopped paying when they got off probation because nobody was paying attention. But that's not the case anymore. I mean, your restitution will continue on. They'll continue to bother you. They'll continue to require you to fill out these financial affidavits. And so it just kind of goes on and on. And if you fail to pay the restitution, they can file a separate charge against you for doing that. You can be held in contempt.
Woof, I didn't know that either. So, boy, okay, so the supervised release is in my experience, you're not going to get violated and sent back to prison unsupervised release unless your actions are quite willful. In other words,
Yes.
that you've spent X money to lease this new Mercedes, and you're living that, you're going to have a big problem if your finances are not right and they think you could be paying restitution but you're not, and
Right.
look at all these other expenses that you have.
Yeah,
So
that's
you
and
need to
if you're
understand.
struggling and you're not being you can't find a job and you can't pay your rent, they're not going to put you back in jail for not paying your restitution. They'll just, keep an eye on you. But the key is communication, keep in contact with your probation officer. And if you're struggling, let them know I can't make these payments. I need to modify the amount that I've been ordered to pay.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that a lot of clients, not a lot, but some clients just get scared because they are not able to make the payments, and they assume that if they're not making them, they're going to be in trouble. But no, if you're really on the up and up and you can communicate with your PO, and also this is probably a good time to consider getting counsel involved too, because counsel could bring it back to court to get a modification of the payment schedule too, right?
Yeah, and I've actually butted heads, imagine that, with
Hmm.
the judiciary on this, because under the Criminal Justice Act, as of now, the courts will not appoint counsel after the fact to assist the clients with these issues. And they really should, because sometimes the government is so very aggressive, and they don't see the hardship side of things, and the defendants have a hard time articulating what they can and can't do. And I wish that the courts would appoint lawyers to help defendants out with these issues, but as of now, they won't do it. And I've had lots of discussions with Denise Aguilar, who's our district liaison, about this, and I know she's really pushing for it.
Yeah.
But the judges at this point don't seem to think that defendants need lawyers for restitution matters. So it's unfortunate.
And that's really doubly unfortunate because if they can't pay restitution, they don't have money to hire private counsel. I'm going to
Right.
backtrack because I just thought of something. There's an issue that has come up in some of the cases that I've had, which is we talked about paying restitution back in advance of sentencing. But I want to just kind of know if you've had this experience and how you navigate it. But I've actually had a situation where a client has had some resources and he has really good opportunities to continue working and make a really solid income so that they can pay back. They would really be on track to pay back even large restitution orders in relatively short order. Now, you would think that if the goal is making the victim whole, that the sooner we could get them paid, and made whole, the better off we would be. But I've actually had prosecutors try to rebut that argument and say, "You judge, you shouldn't take into consideration his ability to pay back restitution because that's unfair to people who don't have resources." In other words, that just means people who don't have resources end up going to do more jail time, where we're giving special consideration to people who do have resources to keep them out, give them probation so that they can work and pay back. And I've always sort of I mean, I understand the rationale, but poor people always get the short end of the stick. But I've never understood this sort of laissez-faire attitude some prosecutors have about, I know there's $1 million restitution, but I don't care. You're going to prison. And I'm going to make sure that by the time you get out of prison, your life is in such fucking shambles that you're never going to be able to pay this stuff back. And I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile that? Even as a former prosecutor, like, how do you reconcile that? Because I see that all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I do think in white collar cases, especially, it is more persuasive because especially when there's been a large amount of loss, it is more persuasive to say this defendant has the ability to pay, because really these victims, they want their money back, right?
Sure.
And if you put someone away for 10 years, the chances of them getting their money back are nil and none. One of the things that I have tried to argue is to say, look, judge, under the sentencing factors set forth in 3553, the court does need to, look at what this person is willing to do for the victim. I mean, the prosecution always says, well, we also have to deter crime, and that's why we're pushing for prison. But we can say, look, this is a defendant who has been rehabilitated, who doesn't want to be involved in any more unlawful activity, and really has the opportunity and also the ability to go out and really pay these people back. And that's what he or she wants to do. And the only way he or she can do it is if your honor doesn't give them a long sentence. So,
Mhm.
I would focus on the sentencing factors and how this particular defendant does have a good chance of making these victims whole. I know
Mhm.
Judge Logan in our district, he looks at that. He really does. If he thinks somebody has the ability to go out and make money, he considers that for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Well, if you're going to talk the talk about making victims whole, and they deserve to be made whole, there's definitely a tension there, and I see it playing out a lot. It's just one of these men is this mentality that we have to send everybody to prison to make an example and deter. And I mean, we've talked about that before. I just think it's kind of nonsensical. Anyway, well, let's see. We got more to cover, so let's move on. You talked about, so another new piece of information for me. I assume once you clear the hurdle of supervised release, yeah, they can come after you, but if they can't get blood from stone and whatever, at least I'm not going back to jail. You're saying you could go back to jail. Have you seen that happen? Like, is that happening
The short answer is no, I have not seen it happen, but the
yet?
statutory scheme allows the court under the Federal Debt Collection Act to hold a party in contempt, just like under state law. If you're ordered to pay a certain amount and you're not doing it, you can be held in contempt. So it's not like going to prison, but it's like civil contempt. Yeah, so that's what that means. Have I seen the courts put people in jail for not paying? I have not,
Yeah.
but usually because we're able to work something out with the government before that, before you get to that point.
Okay. And I imagine it's the same kind of analysis if you legitimately can't pay, that's different than if you're just thumbing your nose and going to Tahiti and drinking Mai Tais.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
and one of the things that's a little bit scary about Arizona, we are a community property state. So let's say, Doug, I go out and I steal $2 million from people in a Ponzi scheme. In Arizona, not only are my assets, recoverable, but they can also go after my husband. And that continues on as long as you were married at the time of the alleged crime. you know that's all they have to show in the state of Arizona, because state law governs the collectability in terms of the community property issue. So if you live, for
oh,
example, in Oklahoma, where I'm from, it's not a community property state, so they can't go after the spouse unless the spouse participated. But
wow.
here in Arizona, they can't. So they could garnish my husband's wages, even though, he had nothing to do with whatever I did.
Well, that is really interesting too, because I've seen situations where people separate or they get divorced, and I think it's really because they think they can protect the assets. But if it's, you're saying if it's after the fact of the offense, it doesn't matter.
It
So
doesn't
stay
matter.
married. Just stay
Yeah, stay
married.
married.
It's too
I will
late.
say, if the spouse has attempted to distance themselves from the defendant, before sentencing, usually the flu unit will leave them alone.
Yeah.
They don't have to under the law, but that's been my experience, that when the spouse, was involved in the fraud and they kind of move on, then flu will leave them alone.
Okay. All
It gets a
right.
little tricky when you have partnerships too, because even if you're in a partnership, the government can get what's called a charging order. So let's say you pay yourself a draw every 4 months out of your partnership. They can't grab onto the partnership, right? Because it's owned by other people. But what they can do is get a charging order for whatever your distribution is, portion of that. So, if you think you're insulated because you have other people in your company, that's not true.
Okay. Well, let's see. I'm looking at the outline. Do we need to talk about collection methods still? Can we do that real
Yeah,
fast?
we can. So there's
Like, how
several.
do they get that money, those flu people?
Yeah, well, I talked about the lien. And so
Uh-huh.
this is an actual lien that is filed typically in the county where the defendant lives. So, it's sometimes they'll attach it to particular property, but other times they'll just file this lien that's out there. So if you ever try to buy or sell anything, this lien comes up. They can also garnish your wages. They can levy on property or assets that you have. They can, those are the basic ones that they do, is garnishment and levy. I think it's really important that we do talk about what's exempted and not,
Yes.
because let's say you have a retirement account under Arizona law, they can't levy on that. They can't collect on that retirement account, but under federal law, they can. So they
Hmm.
can attach a levy to that account and force the holder of the account to pay all your retirement towards restitution, which a lot of people don't realize that can happen. Same with your kids' college funds. They can
Oh,
go into those too, and they will. They will.
wow.
It's unfortunate too, because those people think those kinds of vehicles are protected from creditors, but they're not from the federal government.
Wow.
I
Wow,
know,
wow, wow.
I
So yeah,
know.
you've got a whole list of what's not property, including residence. So I think we talked about that, but I think that's a misnomer that people think if it's my primary residence, it's safe. You're saying it's not. It's not safe.
Nope, there's no homestead exemption. Under Arizona law, I believe now it's up to 150,000, but
Yeah.
that doesn't apply to defense. Now, I will say, they're not in the business of putting people out on the street. Uh,
Yeah.
they usually will work with you in terms of the residents, but it doesn't mean they're going to lift the lien. But if you want to sell your house, usually we negotiate with them and say, okay, we'll pay you 20% of the sales proceeds. So they will work with you on that for sure.
Okay. All right. So yeah, that's a long list of what is not exempt, and it ends with pretty much anything but inheritance. You already talked about spouses' assets, children's assets, stocks, bonds, trusts, social security, retirement. All of it is fair game. What about foreign assets? How does that work? Can they go after? I have a lovely house in, I don't know, where would my lovely house be? Iceland. I've got a super lovely, or Italy. No, I think a lot
Oh
of
yeah,
people have moved.
I'm gonna be on the vineyard in Tuscany. That's where my house is gonna be.
Okay, so
If
you
I
have
don't
a vineyard, you have a house on a vineyard in Tuscany
Yes.
overlooking whatever, Lake Como or whatever, wherever Clooney lives, and you have just committed a very serious federal crime. What happens to that house in Tuscany? How far is the flu's reach?
Well, it's not just flu when you're talking about foreign assets, and it is a little bit more complicated, but the government has what's called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Okay. And there's a whole list of countries with whom we have these treaties with. And of course, most of the European countries are on that list. Canada, Mexico. I mean, if you want to buy a house in North Korea, you're probably good. But
Oh, sweet.
but a lot of the countries now cooperate with one another. And in 2000, when the government really expanded the civil asset forfeiture powers, that act gave a lot of power to the government to go out and seize assets in foreign governments through these treaties. So, those assets are not out of reach. The question is, how valuable is the asset and how much time is the government really going to spend on it? I mean, if
Mm.
there's no equity in the home, they're not going to bother with it. Mexico is a little bit more complicated. Of course, here in Arizona, a lot of people have house. That's my dog.
Hey, puppy. Well, you got a
Um,
couple of them.
yeah, I got a couple of them. They're looking for biscuits under my desk. So the in Mexico, it's a little more complicated. And a lot of people here, have like houses at Rocky Point. And
Yeah.
the reason why it's complicated is because that property, even though it might be in the name of your client, is really owned by the Mexican government, their land trusts. And so, those type of properties, they're not easily forfeited. In other words, it's a mess. And I've had that come up in a lot of cases, believe it or not. And I think they've kind of decided it's not worth the hassle.
That's
Yeah,
interesting
it is.
too,
It's very difficult for them to get
to go to
assets. Also, the
Mexico.
bank owns the property too until that
Yeah.
100-year time passes. So it's not.
Well, so does that apply to liquid funds? So I say I have $1 million in a bank in Panama, you know? So first of all, if I haven't disclosed that as part of the pre-sentence process, I could be in big trouble because you have to disclose it. But now they know about it. Is the same deal. They can just, there's an agreement with that government and they'll just empty my bank account.
Well, so usually DOJ will contact, it's called the Office of International Affairs, and they'll determine right away how much cooperation they're going to get from Panama, let's say. but they then, it's almost like domesticating a foreign judgment, right? They send the judgment over to Panama and then they file it or do whatever they have to do there. And then the government or the courts in Panama order that particular bank to forfeit the funds over. So yeah, they could grab your money in Panama if they have that particular treaty. I don't know if Panama's on the list. Of course, all the big countries are Japan,
Yeah.
all the European countries. I mean, it's a pretty long list.
Yeah. I
They're
can
not.
imagine. I can
Yeah.
imagine. Well, did we get through our pretty long list? Is there anything else that our devoted listeners need to know about restitution? I
Well,
have I have a
I just,
thought, but I
yeah,
want
I mean, my only thought is that, as I think there's a lot of lawyers overlook restitution because they're so concerned, of course, about the amount of time that the client's going to do. But, these restitution can be extraordinarily onerous. You can't own anything if you have a large restitution order because the government's going to take it. And that's very stressful. And I feel like a lot of clients don't know that. They're not given advice about that. And so I think it's really important that we educate our clients that if they have a restitution order, the government can do all of these things to them. And they
to.
need to be aware of it, not when they get out of prison, but when they're signing their plea agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we overlook that. We get hyper focused on time, and that's the be all end all. And the truth is, I'm the narrative guy. Like this is all about storytelling. And what story do we tell? The story the other side tells is you took this money, you caused this harm, you have to pay it back, sit down and shut up. And that's fine. But there's a bigger story here, which is that punishment, which is one of the goals of sentencing, comes in many forms, well beyond just the time you're spending in prison. And what you've told me today has really educated me on the real ripple effect. I mean, obviously, if you commit a crime, the people who are closest to you suffer in innumerable ways. But I didn't realize, you know, wife's wages, spouse's wages, spouse's property, kids' college funds, and I don't know if our clients realize that either, but when they're standing up and talking to the judge about understanding how badly they messed up and how deeply sorry they are, it sounds like there's a lot of apologies that we could make that would genuinely demonstrate sincere remorse to all the people that are going to be affected by these actions. And then also say, Judge, this is punishment this is layers and layers of punishment, not just paying it back, that's not punishment, but seeing how my actions have made the people that I love suffer, never mind these total strangers. And the faster we can get out and get back to life and make this situation right, the better off we'll be, I guess. I mean, that's how it should work.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate here in our district because the judges here don't order interest payments on judgments, which is
Oof.
astonishing to me that some districts do. And I don't know why there's not more uniformity on that. But there are many jurisdictions that order interest. So imagine, you've got an $8 million restitution order, and then you're going to pay interest on top of that. I mean, you're
Mm.
never ever going to be able to pay that back.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's lots of consequences when you've got a restitution order. And, of course, your employer is going to know because they're going to garnish your wages. So there's just so many different things that I don't think people understand. So I thank
Yeah.
you for letting me come on to talk about this so very important issue because I do feel like it's overlooked. And so thanks for listening.
Well, thanks for doing it, and welcome to the Repeat Offender Club as your second appearance on the podcast. And I hope we can do another one, and maybe we don't have to wait 100 more episodes to get you back.
Yes.
But in the meantime, this kind of is not kind of, this is a very specialized sort of knowledge that you have, and I imagine that people would really benefit from your insight and your services. So, I hope that I hope nobody has the problem that they would need to reach out to you for, but I hope that if they did, check out www.azwhitecollarcrime.com and give Ashley Adams a ring because she is the creme de la creme of white collar defense attorneys. So
Thank
I'm so glad to see you on this
you.
Friday
Glad to see
afternoon.
you.
Have a good
I hope you're
weekend.
gonna do a jam on Facebook tonight. I'll be watching.
Well, it's interesting. I don't think I've done a jam on Facebook in the last 4 years. I'll leave it to you to determine what was different in the last 4 years that was the previous 4 years. But it was a lot of mental health for me to go on and play music in tumultuous times, and so I just have a feeling that I'm going to be back on Facebook playing music real soon.
Oh,
But
I hope so. I hope
yeah,
so. Yeah,
yeah.
I enjoy it a lot.
Well, thanks. Do you know I have a record out?
Well, I mean, you're my friend on Facebook, so I saw something about that.
I
I haven't
I
listened to
really
it, but I will.
well, so why not plug that too? It's called One Good Thing. It's my first record. This is my 40th year of playing guitar, but it took me 40 years to make an actual album. But it's on all the streaming services. So if you just look up Doug Pass and One Good Thing, and because I'm so vain. I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I pressed it on vinyl. So I have the actual album coming out, and it's going to
Oh,
be here next week for
that's
the for
exciting.
my three friends that have record players. I'm gonna give
So
them, right.
talented. I'm not.
Give us
I don't know
give
how
me
to
an album.
sing or dance. The only thing I can do is practice law.
Well, there's something to be said for that. That's pretty good, and you're damn good at it. So I'll talk to you soon.
All
Thanks for
right, Doug,
this,
thank
Ashley.
you.
Be
Take care.
well.
All
Bye
righty.
bye.
Bye.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.